This lesson will discuss using if, else, and else if. The topics include: how can you use if? What about else? Why use else if? How are these commands considered branching? And how would these commands be used in a website? Moving now to our first code example, we are going to use if and then later if and else to determine a website user's status. On line 6, we assign a variable $user a value of Joe. On line 8, we assign a variable $status a value of normal. On line 11, we have an if statement. Notice the syntax of the if statement. The word if followed by a space, which is optional. In parentheses, we have a comparison expression. The comparison expression can be a simple expression or a complex expression involving parentheses, ands, and ors. In this case, we have a simple expression. We're testing to see, is the variable $user equal to admin? If so, the block of code represented between the opening and the closing braces, the opening brace being on line 11 at the end, the closing brace being on line 13, all of the statements between the closing braces will be executed if the condition proves to be true. In this example, the only code that will be executed if true is that $status will be assigned a value of super. Moving now to line 20, a slightly different approach. In this example, we're testing to see if the user is not equal to admin. If so, the code on lines 21 and 22 will be executed. Again, notice the opening brace on line 20, the closing brace at the beginning of line 23. On line 23, we also have an else clause, which is executed if the expression evaluates to false. If the expression evaluates to false, the code on lines 24 and 25 will be executed. So let's follow the flow of logic. User is Joe, so line 11, the expression will come back as false, which means line 12 is skipped. This is referred to as branching. On line 20, is the user not equal to admin? The answer to that is true, which means that lines 21 and 22 will be executed. PHP will then branch to line 27, skipping the code represented in the else clause, which is lines 24 and 25. Moving now to the browser, let's take a look at the output of this first example. So as expected, user Joe, status normal, message, welcome Joe. Now let's move back to the code and change the user value from Joe to admin. We'll save this, move back to the browser, refresh the screen, and as you can see, the result is now user admin, the status is now super, and the message has changed to please check the error log. Let's now move to the second code example. We are going to introduce now what is referred to as a nested if statement. A nested if statement is where you have an if statement that is inside the braces for another if statement. So in this case, the nested if statement starts on line 12. The outer if statement is on line 10. So checking the logic, we are now testing to see, is the user variable set by using isSet. If that is true, the code starting on line 11 and following through to 16 will be executed. On line 12, we have the inner if statement. We're testing to see, is the user admin? If so, we set the status to super. Otherwise, the else clause is executed and the status is set to normal. Going back to line 10, if the user variable is not set, the code branches down to line 18 and the code within the else clause is executed. So notice in this case that we are echoing the value of the user variable if it's set. If it's not set, we are assuming that the value is guessed and we echo the appropriate statement. So moving now to the browser, let's have a look at the output of the second example. So as we can see, user admin, status super. Moving now to the third code example, we're going to now introduce the usage of the else if clause. In this example, we're examining various currencies. We assign a price, we assign a currency, we then test to see, is the currency euro? If not, PHP branches to line 13, where we have an else if clause. You'll notice that else if is a combination of else and if. It has its own comparison expression, which is evaluated. If it's true, it executes the code within its block and then branches down to line 20 in this case. You can have as many else-if clauses as you want. However, when they start to get to be too numerous, it might be a good idea to consider using switch, which is discussed in another lesson. So looking down the code example, we test currency to see if it's equal to euro, US dollars, Canadian dollars. Otherwise, we set the rate to 1. On line 21, we're bringing back the printf command to display the price, which is represented as a floating point number, price times the rate, and we also represent the currency itself. So moving back to the browser, let's have a look at the third example. So we can see here the price is, although originally 100, is now set to 156.20 Canadian dollars. So if we change the currency to something else, okay, for example, Great British Pounds, go ahead and run the code example again. You can see the price becomes 100 Great British Pounds. Because Great British Pounds is not represented in any of the if or else if clauses, this becomes the default in this example. So in review, how can you use if? You'd use if and a comparison expression to make decisions in your PHP scripts. What about else? Else is used when you need an alternative or an either-or decision. Why use else if? Else if is needed if you want to have additional clauses to your if statement. How are these commands considered branching? They allow your program to flow in different directions. So if the if clause is true, that code is executed, your code then branches to the line following the if statement. You can think of it like branches of a river or like branches of a tree. And how would these commands be used in a website? They would allow your program to do different things based on input or different conditions which might exist at the time that the program is running. This concludes our discussion of using if, else, and else if.